Morning, everyone. Morning here on the West Coast. My name is Harmony. I'm from the Tla'amin Nation, and it is a beautiful day here on Tsleil-Waututh territory in North Vancouver. I see we have one good morning in the chat. Just invite everybody to say good morning, say hello to each other, or afternoon, whatever time it is in your zone. And we are here for webinar 5, I think, 5 of 6. So we're getting close. Let us know if this is your first or if you've been throughout. I see lots of familiar names in the chat and in the participant list so far, which is awesome. Okay, next slide, please. So today we are, as I said, in webinar 5 of 6. This is the series organized by the self-governing Indigenous governments to, well, we're starting to get to the more practical knowledge about data to support Indigenous governments and their responsibilities. So far we started macro and we're starting to get into more of that kind of at the desk practical aspects that governments will need to grapple with and consider as they look to mature the use of data within their government functions. So I'll do my usual quick little spiel here. We started at session 1, kind of at that high level, talking about core concepts. We got an introduction to the toolkit and to the collaborative amongst the self-governing Indigenous governments. We heard from my friend Gwen Phillips from Toolkit Nation on the work that they've been doing for the last probably 20 plus years in maturing the use of data within their systems, tying this to their vision, to their strategic plan, and now into performance measurement. So something to kick off kind of that state where we can maybe see ourselves in our governments doing similar kinds of work. And we're all at different places in that journey, my own government included. The second session, we started talking about the assessment tool that's available to you in the toolkit. I'll talk a little bit more about that to kick off today's webinar. And we also talked about how to help the people side of change. So nothing happens without people actually being part of the process. And there's lots of strategies and tools you can use to help bring decision makers, your colleagues, other people along on this journey. Session 3, Laurel and I provided an overview of data governance, and we took the angle of kind of a realistic approach so that people know the kinds of barriers, challenges, limitations that you may have to face when trying to source your data from external sources. And we're going to circle back to that topic today. So Laurel and I talked about how did we go about accessing data from groups like the Ministry of Health or Ministry of Education, the First Nations Information Governance Center, all these organizations that have data that may be useful for you. How do you go about navigating their processes of data governance, data access requests, information sharing agreements, etc. And then we also talked about what governments are going to need to set up in terms of their own infrastructure to manage and govern that data. So policy, law, data governance committees, structures for decision making. So that was what we covered in session 3. Yes, we did get a bit of a break. And then session 4 yesterday, we started talking about designing well-being indicators and tracking, how do we track change in those indicators? So we covered a lot of ground yesterday that could be almost its own 2 or 3 day workshop if we wanted to. So this covered how do you tie indicators to goals across multiple consumers of data. So we talked about having your government having, a goal of healthy children and youth, for example, and the kinds of indicators that citizens might be interested in, that elected officials might be interested in, and that program leads might be interested in, but all moving towards the same goal. So we talked about how do you go about identifying those indicators and setting targets and benchmarks and evaluating those indicators through time. And then today we're going to talk a bit about the data available against those indicators that you care about. So again, there's a bit of overlap between webinars 3 and today in that, and all of these topics are actually really highly related, but in some ways the data that you have and administrative data that you can source from external parties shapes your indicators drive the work that you want to do to source data internally or externally, whether that's through external data governance mechanisms, through mining your own data, or through doing some primary data collection. So this bundle of webinars 3, 4, 5 are connected in many ways. And so we're going to be exploring these concepts further with Big River Analytics in the 2 hours we have this morning. Next slide, please. I'm tired of saying this. You must be tired of hearing it. I think everybody's almost attending all these webinars. So we're recording. We'll be posting this to the website. Don't be afraid to turn your camera on, though. You won't be showing up in the recording. I see some folks have their cameras on, so feel free to do that. It helps us as presenters to be able to see people and see their reaction to the content that we're sharing. To ask questions anytime, throw them in the chat. Again, that really helps us to know how you're interacting with the material and what you need for the webinars and the toolkit to be successful. You can also put your hand up anytime for questions. Again, I think we're getting better as we go. So today you're going to hear a lot less from me, which I'm happy to take a bit of a talking break on these sessions. I'm going to be looking at my second monitor though, and my notes in front of me, and we'll all try to not move too fast, although we do get excited and talk quickly. Next slide. Just orienting you to the Zoom. Bottom left-hand corner is your main mute and video. Chat in the middle. Looks like everybody knows how to use that. And the raise hand function over on the right corner. The top right corner, there should be a little box called View. In that, if you click it, you can select side-by-side speaker view, which means you'll only see those of us that are spotlighted as presenters, or you can choose gallery view, which will allow you to see everybody who's got their camera on. Next slide. Key terms, I'm going to cover less today on this, but we're all here to talk about data, which is all around us everywhere, the things we observe, see, whether those be quantitative in terms of numbers or qualitative in terms of description. The collection of this information to drive decision-making is a basic activity of government, and governance improves when you use data. Next slide. Our presenters today are going to cover a number of terms: administrative data, primary data, and secondary data. I'm not going to bother covering them because they're the experts, not me, but I would say these are in the glossary of terms that are available in the toolkit. So you always have that available to you. Next slide. And again, like just resurfacing some of the concepts from yesterday. Outcomes, measurable statements, letting us know when we've achieved a certain goal. Indicators, a piece of data that helps us know whether we're making progress against that outcome. And having a suite of those outcomes and indicators helps us assess performance, which is collecting, analyzing, reporting information against indicators and outcomes that relate to performance in areas that we care about. And in terms of governance, often relates to the scope of functions that any government, including yours, would be carrying out. Next slide. Also just wanted to make the connection to the other tool in the toolkit. I neglected to do this yesterday, so my apologies for that. In the assessment tool, there are a couple of areas that relate to the content we're going to cover today. So you'll see I just kind of copied and pasted that onto the slide here, but there is a section of the assessment tool, and you can see on the right-hand side, there's links to the exact tools that correspond with the things we're going to talk about today. So really wanting to make sure that there's good understanding that when we're covering topics here, there's associated tools for that available to you in the toolkit. Next slide. So today we're going to hear from our friends at Big River. So they are prepared to introduce themselves. So I will just hand it straight over to Hannes.
Awesome. Thanks, Harmony. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to introduce myself and speak with you today about acquiring and working with data in a really specific context that aligns with my personal and professional interest. My name is Hannes Ettinger. I'm Métis from Alberta originally, but I've been living up in Tsimshian territory for the last 10 years. I'm an economist by training, and I'm the managing director of Big River Analytics. For the past 10 years, I've been working with Indigenous governments, helping them acquire and work with data to benefit their citizens and members. In fact, one of the very first contracts that I ever worked on when I struck out on my own was supporting the Nisga'a government to develop indicators in an effort to measure well-being as part of their government's well-being strategy. So this is a space that I've been working in for a long time now. It's been, a great journey and a lot of hard work, and I'm really excited to kind of share some of the things that we've learned as an organization with you today. So since then, Big River has kind of grown into a larger national scale consulting service. So we've got a team of economists, statisticians, and management experts across Canada working directly with Indigenous communities, governments, and organizations, generally supporting, data-related or data-specific projects. Our mission is to provide statistical and analytical capacity to benefit Indigenous governments, organizations, and peoples in Canada. And we do that by providing industry-leading research and data analytics capacity to Indigenous organizations. And we pair that with a management and governance support services. So in the last few presentations, you would have heard about the importance of kind of setting up the foundation and infrastructure to do this kind of work. So we do that in addition to the specific data analytics piece. I would say we have a unique combination of talented, values-driven professionals that really have a desire to support Indigenous peoples, communities, and organizations in their ability to leverage data to their advantage. So kind of shifting the historical narrative on its head and using data to benefit Indigenous peoples as opposed to it being used to their disadvantage. Our approach has been to redefine the client-consultant relationship, and we do that by kind of taking a slow walk like we're going to do today, assessing and understanding where clients are at and where they'd like to go. There's a lot of hard work and many steps in this process in terms of starting as a novice data user and moving along that continuum to becoming an expert data user. And so there's not really an effective way to rush through that process and make those assessments. So we like to take our time and do a good job of that slow walk together. I've said already 4 or 5 times that this is really hard work, and I'll probably continue to say that. I'm also going to try and motivate you though with some, real success stories and the value in doing this work and starting on this path to becoming a data expert user, or an expert data user rather. And as evidence of this, we've helped clients secure literally billions of dollars in funding to advance their programs and services over the past 10 years. And that just speaks to the power of becoming, effective data users. And in terms of who we work with primarily and who we're most interested in working with, we love working with Indigenous governments and organizations that have a real desire to improve outcomes and measure performance. We find that desire is often accompanied with a concrete need to communicate the potential or existing success of their programs and services. And that's really where we've kind of found our calling and our favorite type of work. I'll turn it to Rebecca to introduce herself as well. She's going to help me throughout today. I get pretty nervous in these presentations, so I felt like I needed some moral support from my teammate.
Always happy to jump in and help. Hello, everyone. My name is Rebecca Wartzman. Thank you all for having me here today. I'll also be joining the group, I think, the next webinar. So looking forward to seeing everyone again then. I'm joining you all from the territory of the Lekwungen speaking people, the Wisanet, Songhees, and Esquimalt nations. I was originally born in Ontario, and my family roots go back to Wales and England and a whole kind of whack of Eastern European countries. And I'm really excited and grateful for having had the opportunity to be working with Big River for the last 2 years. A bit of my background and experience and how I got here today and kind of why I'm speaking to the group today. I was always interested in social and environmental issues, and my interest was really rooted in understanding the cultural and historic context in which these issues emerged. And so in my wise youth, I thought English literature would be the best avenue for understanding these pieces and making change. And after enough people in kind of social settings and dinner parties and parents, friends rolled their eyes and asked what I could possibly do with such a valuable degree, I started to think about the things that were most exciting to me and the changes I wanted to see in the world and what kind of tool sets were out there to be able to be useful in making change. And so I took an economics course in undergrad, kind of curious to see what it had to offer. And really my motivation there is about understanding economics and data really as a tool to be used in different cultures and different contexts, and to understand the assumptions that underpin how traditional economics thinking has been used to date, where those kind of tools and models have served different communities and different groups, and where they haven't served different communities and different groups, and kind of why that was and how it came to be. So my interest in economics is about understanding the assumptions, understanding where they don't fit with different cultures, where they don't fit for different outcomes or kind of areas, and have since gone on to do a master's in economics, which again was really about understanding the tools and how that toolkit can be used in different contexts. After my master's, I went and worked for the Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation here in BC. And my focus was really on Indigenous women's issues, and I supported the Minister's Advisory Council on Indigenous Women, and that was a really fantastic experience, lots of learning, lots of understanding about where government works and doesn't work for Indigenous women in Indigenous communities, and pent up lots of kind of frustrations about the way that government worked, and was chatting with a friend about some of those frustrations, and she said, hey, you should probably talk to Hannes because he's pretty much doing all of these things out of a consulting firm in Terrace. So I was really excited to hear about the work at Big River. And it seemed like such a natural fit. So that was kind of how I came to be here today. And since joining Big River, I've just been combining that interest and passion for social, economic, and environmental equity with a real aptitude for organizations and systems and processes. So that's what I'll talk to you a bit about today. What are some of the systems and processes that we implement at Big River to do this work more effectively? My mom used to joke that I was the kid that wanted to type out my spelling homework. So this is how I am, here and present with you and helping Hannes and the team figure out what these systems can look like. And I guess the kind of last point in this introduction is just that I've been learning a lot. We've been learning a lot as a firm, and we're just really excited at the opportunity to share some of these learnings with such a large group of people. And hopefully there's some tools and approaches that you can all pick up and start using to support the work that you're doing within your own governments and nations. I think that's it for me. So I'll pass it back to Hannes. And
sure, we can go to the webinar outline. Next slide. So I've got very few key terms, but I'll go through a couple of them. I've done my best to rid the rest of the presentation with jargon, although I think after being an economist for 10 years, you just can't help. It doesn't even look like jargon to me anymore. So feel free to interject if you need an explanation, or if you want me to kind of touch on any points if there are terms that have kind of crept in that I just assume are, everyone is talking about, but they likely aren't. I'm going to speak again to a bit of the motivation, some specific examples around some of the success that we've seen with organizations that have embarked on this path of becoming expert data users. I've got three main takeaways. These presentations are long, they're kind of complicated. And in the presentations that I always kind of struggle delivering presentations, but I found that I feel effective if I can at least communicate some really key points. And so I've highlighted three key takeaways that I'm hoping will stick with you, and I'll go through those, and then I'll go through them again at the end, so we make sure that at a minimum I've kind of imparted what I think are the most valuable lessons from what we've put together today. And a really big part of that is understanding and setting objectives. So a bit of a risk. This is a section that, well, I like to say it's like when you go to paint a room, you just want to get in there and start painting, but as I've learned the hard way, it's all in the prep, right? You got to do the taping, you got to do the priming, you got to really take care and plan out your process in order to do a good job. So, as I was sanding paint off all the wood beams and trim that I didn't tape, we've kind of learned that same lesson at Big River Analytics, embarking on data collection projects that would have benefited from additional planning at the outset. So we've got kind of a structured process that Rebecca will walk everyone through around understanding and stating objectives. I'll speak a bit about external or existing data sources. So these are secondary data sources. I'll focus primarily on StatsCan because Harmony did such a good job of talking about kind of like those other pieces that, and I think it was webinar 3, where we went into some detail around those additional sources. I worked a lot with StatsCan data, and I'm happy to impart, I guess, the lessons learned in my recommendations in terms of how to use that information effectively. I'll speak a bit about administrative data. I think it's really kind of an underutilized and untapped resource in, when we're trying to inform indicators. That said, it really takes a solid foundation to be able to effectively use administrative data. So you've got to have that data governance framework kind of in place before you can start to effectively use administrative data. And then I've got a big section on primary data, which I'm hoping is like the exciting part, because that's the exciting part for me. So at a minimum, my enthusiasm will hopefully kind of like bring you back to the presentation after we've talked about all these like planning pieces. Primary data collection is the thing that got me excited as a second-year undergrad, and it's like, I mean, that was a long time ago at this point, and it still gets me excited. So I've got a whole bunch of slides there, and I hope that people can interject with some examples or questions as we go. This is something that we've done literally hundreds of times now, and I feel like we've really refined some processes and have a good understanding of the landscape and the things that you need to do to be successful in going out and collecting primary data. On to the next slide, please. So I've already basically used all these terms probably 3 or 4 times without even defining them. So I will go back and define them, and then maybe it'll make a little bit more sense. But I mean, there are all sorts of ways that you can talk about data. Data, there are many different taxonomies for data, but one that's really useful that I find really helpful is understanding primary and secondary data. And this really delineates the different aspects of our talk today. So that's what I'm going to focus on. So primary data is data that you go out and collect expressly for the purpose of answering a specific research question. So you would have deeply understood your information needs, know what you need to collect, and you're going to go out into the world and you're going to collect data to answer that question. Secondary data, on the other hand, is data that was collected for some other purpose. So it's existing, it's out in the world, or it resides in an administrative data collection process, and you would harness it then to answer your specific research question. So this is a useful way to think about these 2 different data collection and acquisition processes, because they entail very different requirements in terms of level of effort, in terms of budget, in terms of just the activities that you'll be undertaking. These are entirely different beasts, although they can work together. And I'll explain how that all works, but a useful way to think about these things. And so in general, primary data, you'll either be conducting a census, which is when you would speak to everybody in the population, or more likely you'd be doing a sample. So you speak to a subset of a population in your data collection exercise. So when you're going out in the field to collect that information. Secondary data will generally originate from external sources. So like StatsCan, FNIGC, or other external data holders, or it'll reside in an administrative database. So it'll be internal, but it won't have been used for the purpose that you're imagining at that point. So that's it. That requires there's a different set of requirements to effectively use administrative data, and we'll get into that a little bit. Next slide, please. Okay, motivation. So again, I think every single time we've heard how hard and how challenging building the frameworks and the foundation that you need to effectively be expert data users is, and I think that we need a couple slides here to motivate that hard work. I think that many or most practical problems are best solved using a data-oriented approach. Mea culpa, I'm an economist, so of course that's how I see things. But we've really seen a lot of success in this approach. And clients that we started working with as novice data users, as they become more and more experienced and seeing the success that you can have from a data-oriented approach, that success just really kind of builds on itself and it's like a self-propelling or self-reinforcing positive feedback loop. It's hard at first. I was telling Harmony before we jumped on, getting into or like embarking on this data user journey as a novice data user is a little bit like trying to get back into the gym after 10 years. And like, I've done that. And you really have to have a lot of faith at the outset. You know, those first 3 months are like hard work, and it's just hard work, period. You're not seeing any gains and no improvement, no real change. But then as you start to see the benefits, as you start to accrue the benefits, it gets easier and easier, and you're getting better and better. So I think that's just a good analogy for this work, in that there's, at the outset, really, there's got to be a bit of a leap of faith and understand that there are benefits out there. This is a worthwhile endeavor, and it's going to be painful at the start. Just acknowledging that, I think, is important. So in terms of motivation, examples of how data can be useful in governance is informing indicators. Like that's why we're here today. We've seen a lot of great success in using data to inform indicators to track change, and a good example is housing work. So we work on a lot of housing related projects. One example would have been working in the Northwest. As many people will know, there's a big industrial project, LNG Canada and Coastal GasLink, there's this big industrial project, and there was a lot of concern regionally about the impact of the influx of workers and all of this economic activity, how that would impact housing within those communities. And so we were engaged to perform a study to develop indicators to describe the state of housing prior to the influx of all of these workers and all of this economic activity, and then to update those indicators regularly throughout the construction and operation phases of these projects, so we can understand how housing has changed and how it's been impacted by these projects. This is a good way to inform policy to kind of mitigate some of those negative effects that creep up in situations like those. Data is great for providing a rationale for action. So I think that the best example of this that I've been a part of, for anyone on the call that worked in ARDAs or assets, or now it's called the ISET agreement, this is like a big national scale Indigenous employment and training program that's provided through Employment and Social Development Canada. This program was originally informed by data from the 1996 census, and that never changed. So for the first 20 years of its life, the way that funding was allocated and the way that program was based on data from the 1996 census, which is kind of atrocious if you think about it. But every year, ESDC saw a need for more funding and went to the Treasury Board in an effort to secure additional funding, because there was an obvious need, right? They saw the ARDAs, they saw the assets, and what they heard was, like, we're doing good work, but we need more money. And they didn't have a lot of success with that request. In fact, funding was frozen at 1996 levels for 20 years. So you can imagine your purchasing power over 20 years is just eroded every single year, right? So the program that was big and impactful at the outset, 20 years later, was not particularly effective because the funding had been so eroded. And so we did a study with ESDC on documenting the erosion of that spending power, on developing a set of indicators that describe the gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous employment outcomes within economic regions, so to show the potential for the impact. And we built this econometric model and sent it to the Treasury Board. And for the first time in 20 years, the ISETS program was renewed with hundreds of millions of dollars in additional funding over a 10-year funding horizon. And so I guess this is a good example because, over the 20 years, every year they were asking for more money. And when they finally decided, like, listen, let's get down to brass tacks. Let's take a data-oriented approach to this, and let's document the challenge that ISET agreement holders are up against and why they need additional funding. And when we took that approach, when we went to the data, when we used charts and figures and tables to really make a strong argument as to why this program needed additional funding, they were rewarded with hundreds of millions of dollars. And that program now has a 10-year funding envelope with that incremental funding as well. And I guess a smaller case study that, in terms of measuring performance, we're working with the community on a community-based reporting project that is basically a process of building a custom database to track indicators that they've defined and that they feel are important for their internal governance, but then also to speak to all of the funders that are funding their programs and services. This is like a kind of like a one-stop shop that we've built and iterated on over time in an effort to minimize the reporting burden on this community. It's focused on employment and training, but it also spans other aspects of their programs and services. Next slide, please.
And I'll just jump in, Hannes. Really, that last bullet on community-based reporting is, it's about allowing a community that knows and understands their story really well to put those numbers to that story. And so that's a huge benefit to them, because obviously reporters and funders, reports for funders, they need those numbers, but also they're interested in telling that story to their community, to the band council, to all sorts of different stakeholders that are interested in learning. And so having that be a one-stop shop with reporting that's a little bit more streamlined for them allows them to tell their story in a really data-driven way, which really complements some of the stories and kind of success stories at the individual level that they know to be true in terms of the impact of their programming. So just a kind of final point on that motivation for data, it also allows the nation or governments to be able to tell the story and to speak the truths that people know to be true, but maybe don't have or understand how to use the data effectively to communicate that story.
Right. So last time I say this, I promise, it's hard work, but the payoff is worth it. I think a key point here is that I think when people when I'm talking about becoming an expert data user, I don't mean necessarily developing, comprehensive internal capacity where, departments head are also trained economists or statisticians. Like, that's not what we're talking about. I think what we've seen in working with governments is that expert data users, they achieve a balance between internal and external resources. So there is internal capacity in that they know how and when to pick up the phone and use external resources effectively. So it's not something that, you're taking on yourself. Like, no one on this call needs to learn how to code or program to be an effective data user, is what I'm trying to say. You just need to know when you need someone to write code for you, basically. And that's the learning that we're trying to do here. That's what we're trying to impart. We're going to get into the weeds a little bit, but ultimately, you can rely too little or too much on external resources, and finding that balance between what you should be doing internally and what you should be doing externally is really, that's the path towards becoming an expert data user. And again, the success that we've seen working with Indigenous governments that have become expert data users is tremendous. It's motivating for us, and it really makes, encouraging people to embark on this path easy to do, just because we've seen so much success. Next slide, please. Okay, my 3 key takeaways. We'll jump right into the first one. This is not glamorous, and I'll let Rebecca speak a bit more to this, because she's really kind of like taken on this role and the responsibility of making sure that on all of our projects, we deeply understand our information needs. But I'll just say that in our experience in the last 10 years of doing this, the most important step in acquiring data is deeply understanding your information needs. And developing an understanding of those information needs is best achieved in a structured, coordinated setting. So we call that a statement of objectives meeting. It can be, you can call it whatever you want. It's got some key features, and I'll let Rebecca speak to some of those.
Thanks, Hannes. Yeah, so the statement of objective meetings or process, it essentially boils down to 5 basic steps. And those steps all have a series of questions that you want to ask yourself before you embark on this project. So this is very much the prep work before the painting. These questions might feel not like the most glamorous or fun ones to be asking yourselves, but it's really important before you undertake this process, because it essentially allows the process to be more effective. I think we've all had experience where you're thinking about a survey, or you're thinking about, a research project, and the final report lands on your desk, and you start to make your edits kind of in a Word document, commenting or tracking your changes at that stage. But really, ultimately, some of those comments would have been much better in the planning process, because those linkages or opportunities that you're seeing when you see a final report aren't really things that you're capable of acting on if you've already, undertaken a survey, analyzed the data, it might be a little bit too late to act on those pieces. So it does make the process more effective. It allows you to leverage more opportunities before you undertake data collection. And so it's something that we found has been really beneficial, and we've used in a lot of different settings in a lot of different ways. So really the steps boil down to the first being understanding what your information need is. And so that looks like asking yourself the question, why am I undertaking this research project, or why am I setting out this survey? And the idea is to get from, what are often start as vague research interests down to really specific research questions. And so I think we can all imagine a scenario where we know that, we want to better understand what's going on with youth and elders in a community, for example. We want to understand what's going on so that we can enhance their well-being. Well, what does that look like in terms of an actual research question? There's lots of different kind of components to that problem to break out and be more specific about. So is this access to programs? Is this current state of health? Is this experiences within the healthcare system? Is this educational opportunities? They may all be really interesting, but if you remain in we want to understand the well-being of elders and youth, and then try to develop a survey or try to develop a research project to answer that question without getting more granular, you'll end up having a lot of different expectations and ideas and interests in terms of what that research project is actually setting out to do. So that first set is really about narrowing and specifying the information needs, and we'll talk more about that in later slides. The next step is about understanding the data uses and users. So why is this research being undertaken, and then who is going to make use of the information, who's making use of the data, what are these indicators designed to communicate, are the types of questions you're asking. And understanding that information helps whoever is undertaking the research understand, how important is precision. Do we want to put out a survey to a sample or a subset or case study with interview with a few people in our community, or do we really need to get the opinions and information from our entire community or citizenship? The next piece is around operational definitions and concepts. So again, these are sometimes questions that aren't the most glamorous to answer, but I suspect that if I think about my definition of youth and elders, and you all think about your definitions of youth and elders, we'll probably have slightly different characteristics and demographics that we're thinking about. And so laying out in clear terms what the operational definitions and concepts are related to your research project is really important, or else you might end up with research or data collected on youth and elders that don't actually represent the youth and elders that you know and want to be included in your study or in your indicator development. The next step, so this would be step 4 in the process, is around research design. So if you're undertaking a survey, what does this look like? What methodology makes the most sense? What types of survey questions are you asking? And this process of research design becomes a lot easier once you've answered, the first 3 steps. So what are your information needs? What are your data uses? What are those operational definitions? It makes the actual drafting of something like a survey or a research methodology a lot simpler to undertake, because you've done all the hard work in thinking about kind of what is the ultimate constraints or outcomes or opportunities that you're trying to achieve with this project. And then it allows you to make decisions around your research design a lot more readily. And to Hannes's point, there might be components of those questions that you've answered and you're not exactly sure what the most appropriate methodology is, but you've done the work of answering that question and defining like what's important to you. And then you can leave it, potentially to other people to get engaged with, who are more familiar with methodology or more familiar with analysis, to actually make the decision based on that information, rather than leaving the kind of keys to the castle to the analysts or to the folks designing your research, and then realize that they may have misunderstood the ultimate objective and uses of the data that you set out to achieve in the first place. And then the last step here is around analysis plans. And so again, we'll speak to all of these steps in more detail later, but this is about actually making sure and testing and putting down on paper that you can answer the questions you set out to answer. So looking at, for instance, your survey questions and figuring out what tables, charts, statistics, indicators you're actually going to be able to create to make sure that you're asking the right questions so you're getting the right answers at the outset. And if you go through that whole process and you answer all those questions, it's generally really clarifying. Oftentimes people come to research projects, there's lots of different interests or departments that might be showing up for that conversation. And a huge benefit is that it lays out everyone's expectations in a clear, consistent way. And then people have the opportunity upfront to say, hey, this isn't what I was expecting. I want to achieve X, Y, and Z, or, oh, this is an opportunity I hadn't thought of. Let's try to, maybe align across a bunch of different departments to make use of this project for more users and more uses than we had originally set out to achieve. So that's kind of the primer. It's been a really useful and kind of malleable framework for starting projects with different communities. And we'll talk to all of those steps in more detail later in the slides.
Next slide, please. So this is, I guess the second key takeaway is this idea of like a data user continuum. So, novice data users being on one end of the continuum and expert data users being on the other end. And then a few ways to kind of like understand what a novice data user looks like and what an expert data user also looks like. So we found in our experience that novice data users tend to rely too much or too little on external support. So they'll either, just want to hand the whole problem off and not be engaged. And that's a challenge because the information needs are really an internal thing, and simply handing a project off doesn't generally produce the best outcome. Or trying to do everything internally as well. Like there's a line to draw there, and expert data users have some internal capacity, but know when to rely on external experts.
I guess what's useful here, Hannes, just before you keep going down the list is, we think of data users not just necessarily as like the individual person within your organization who uses data. Like we're thinking of data users as, your government as a data user or your nation as a data user. How much experience and expertise and capacity and systems do you have in place kind of collectively as well as on the individual level? So that might kind of help motivate people's thinking around some of the examples you're sharing.
For sure, yeah. And I really just got kind of one more point to make here before I think you've got a few other things that you could run through. And that's around, like I said before, this benefits piece. It's like the real challenge here is that novice data users or organizations that are new to using data tend not to have experienced any of the benefits, and yet they've got the most work to do. And so this is kind of the challenge in getting people on this path, is that, the real benefits kind of accrue a little bit later in the process. At which point, everyone's already convinced. You probably got multiple internal data champions, and the process is really rolling. It's really at the outset where there hasn't been a lot of wins or a lot of success or a lot of benefit derived from using data that all of the hard work needs to take place. Whereas, for experts, they've got a track record of probably a couple of years of some major wins and big successes, and these things are much easier for them. So it's a bit of a frustration in this space in developing this capacity, because you don't get the benefits until you've done the work, but it's hard to be motivated at the outset because it does seem like this stuff is far away, whereas once you're already rolling, it's a piece of cake and you're accruing tons of benefits.
And the one kind of takeaway I would add to this kind of description, so we have some examples of some potential things that we've seen amongst data users. So thinking about being a bit too bold or a bit too fearful. And that's generally because there's a, potentially limited understanding of the risks or really inflated understanding of the risks. People get really scared for good reason about the privacy implications. And we'll kind of get into that more in data in the webinar number 6. But really the kind of takeaway here is to just acknowledge that every organization, like Big River included, is making their progress along this spectrum. And the kind of worst case scenario would be for you to look at this list and see yourself represented somewhere on it, and then freak out and try to achieve everything to get you over to the expert data user column. And really, this is about incremental change and taking these data projects and data opportunities as opportunities. So, maybe it's an opportunity to run a survey, but that could be, an opportunity to bring together a bunch of different departments and talk about what all of their respective data use and needs are, and see where, what could have been a bit of a siloed survey could fill and support multiple data initiatives across the organization. So thinking about all these projects as those incremental opportunities, not just to solve the piece of work at hand, but also to think more broadly about the capacity that you're building and the successes that you're kind of working towards. And I think there's lots of connections between this slide and some of the organizational change management pieces that were shared in some of the earlier webinars. But again, the takeaway is not to think about this as a long laundry list of things to tick off. It's more about how can you take these as opportunities to push organizations and governments and nations towards building that capacity internally and generating some momentum around data use.
Next slide, please. And so this is something that will probably become pretty clear once we're through all of the slides today. And I feel kind of like uniquely qualified to make this analogy. So primary data collection is a bit like a liver transplant. It's hard, uncomfortable, and a serious undertaking, but sometimes you don't have another option, and the benefits can be tremendous. So I was a liver donor for my brother, and so we went through this, and it was funny because I was like looking through this, and this is actually what popped into my mind. I'm like, wow, this is a lot like doing a liver transplant. The key is to understand when it's necessary and worth it. So it's not something you embark on without, not having another option. And when it's required, the benefits can be tremendous. We've seen great success, and really kind of like the biggest successes that we've seen are on projects where we've done primary data collection. So the potential is huge. And after you've gone through a proper primary data collection exercise, you will have moved along that data use continuum towards becoming an expert. There are aspects of a primary data collection exercise that will force some organizational change and move you from, a novice data user towards being a more expert data user. We found too, these exercises really can serve as a catalyst for organizational change more broadly. There have been lots of good examples where engaging in a primary data collection exercise has really highlighted the specific pieces of that data governance framework that are required for particular organizations. So it's serious business. You don't really want to do it unless you have to, because it's a lot of work and there's kind of no going back once you embark down that path. But the benefits, they can be commensurately large or significant. So I guess it's a bit of a warning, but also an encouragement. If you've done the due diligence, we'll go through some steps on how you ascertain whether or not you need to conduct a primary data collection exercise. And yeah, I guess that's a key takeaway. It's serious business, but worth it if it's something that you need to do.
So I think we're transitioning into talking a little bit about some of the details around external and administrative data sources, and we'll have some more slides on understanding your information needs and what primary data collection can look like. But maybe now we've been talking quite a bit and we can see if there's kind of questions or anything that might be worthwhile pausing and clarifying before we kind of dive into a new suite of information.
Just encouraging folks to throw anything in the chat anytime. I think so far you've all been really clear, and the use of examples is really helpful.
Okay, well, Hannes, next slide.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, so we'll speak about external and administrative data sources. Like I said at the outset, I'm going to focus mostly on StatScan. I think that the other sources have been, have had like a good treatment, and so I'd like to highlight some ways that you can access that information and how I think people should think about it. We'll go on to the next slide. So for StatScan, the key pieces, and like really the key piece, I mean, StatScan, the jewel in their crown is the census, which is useful for some applications for Indigenous governments. It's only conducted once every 5 years, but it is the most comprehensive data collection exercise that takes place in Canada. And properly used, it can be really helpful in a lot of other primary data collection exercises, or even answering and informing indicators, that might come up or that might be produced as a result of the process that we're engaged in today. The other key piece that StatsCan conducts every 5 years, although it's like a little bit less regular, is the Aboriginal Peoples Survey. The APS is it's based on the census, so they get their frame. So the thing that they sample from is the responses to the census, and then they go back and they ask all sorts of more detailed socioeconomic questions, questions about health, questions about education and employment. They go into a lot more detail than the census. However, the APS is only asked off territory. And so kind of like the corresponding piece on territory would be the FNIGC exercises, the FNIGC surveys. And so those are, StatsCan does the APS off territory, FNIGC does their surveys on territory. The questions don't really line up, which is really kind of the challenge in this space. So like if the APS and FNIGC were asking the same questions, you could do comparisons even if the years are kind of misaligned a little bit. But in this case, they don't line up that well. And so we're kind of basically left with the census if we're interested in looking at, a government's population both on and off territory. Particularly on territory, the census is more informative on territory, just because there'd be a concentration of citizens or members, whereas you really have to use StatsCan's geographies to capture people off territory. And so there's a bit of a challenge in there, and I'd be happy to get into detail if anyone has any questions. I've been working with the census in this context for about 15 years, so I can speak in probably way too much detail about the steps required to effectively use the census to inform indicators in this space. That said, many more data sources from StatsCan can be used as a comparison. So we were talking yesterday about indicators and a baseline and identifying gaps and that sort of thing. If you imagine you've got an indicator that's relevant for your citizens or members, and you want to make a comparison, well, you're going to go collect primary data to inform the indicator about your population. You're not going to go out into the broader population and conduct a data collection exercise to get a comparison. And so these data sources can be really useful in establishing a benchmark so that way you can measure those gaps. So if we're interested in the health status of a comparison population, we can go to StatsCan and then ask a similar question on a survey that we conduct internally, and then you've got that comparison, and you don't have to go interview folks that are not members or citizens in order to establish an effective baseline. So that's another way that StatsCan information can be quite helpful. I won't spend a lot of time on FNIGC, Vital Stats, or provincial to territorial statistical agencies. I'll just say that provincial and territorial statistical agencies in general are repackaging StatsCan information, usually. So the exception is in the Northwest Territories, where they do some primary data collection that can be really interesting. They do a community-based survey, and they ask questions that are more relevant in the territories than elsewhere in Canada, and so that's an exception to that rule. That said, developing a bit of a relationship with your provincial or territorial statistical agency can be really advantageous, because what those agencies do is they will repackage StatsCan data, but at a more granular level for within their jurisdictions. And so they might have information that would avoid needing to go to StatsCan directly, order custom tabulations, embark on that whole process. It's a good check if you've got a bit of a relationship with someone at one of those provincial or territorial statistical agencies to reach out and see the information that they would have ordered from StatsCan already. We found that to be useful. They will also do things like, I know BC Stats, for example, has a population projection model that you can use free of charge. So there's some tools that provincial and territorial statistical agencies do have, and I would say it's worthwhile to reach out and develop a bit of a relationship there. That said, the bulk of the work that they do is in repackaging information that originates with StatsCan. On to the next slide, please. Right, so the census, like I said, the most comprehensive data set in Canada. The way that it's effectively utilized is by using this standard geographical classification system that StatsCan has developed. And so the way to use this is to understand which geographies that StatScan uses are representative of your on-territory population and which one might approximate, where the bulk of your members live off territory. If they're anywhere in Canada, they'll be captured in the census. If they're out of the country, then StatScan can't say anything about them. But understanding how this standard geographical classification system works is really kind of key to unlocking the power of the census for your uses. And it's well documented, but relatively quick conversation with an expert would be able to point you in the right direction. They basically could just tell you the numbers that correspond to the relevant geographies for which you should be asking StatScan for data. Something that I haven't actually seen done successfully, but I know it's an opportunity that exists for those governments that have really good comprehensive membership or citizenship databases. StatScan has expressed an openness and willingness to do a linking exercise. So as I was saying, we can get pretty good information about on-territory populations because that's a geography that can be mapped to StatScan's standard geographical classification. But for members or citizens that live off territory, the only alternative to a linking exercise is to just say, well, they live mostly in this area, and so you can narrow down a little bit, but you're not going to be speaking about the specific, your specific citizens or members. Now, the way to get around that would be to do a linking exercise. So if you've got the foundation, if you've got the data governance foundation that would allow you to use that membership or citizenship database to work with StatScan to do a linkage exercise. And so we're talking about certainly someone towards the expert data user end of the spectrum. StatScan has expressed a willingness to actually link the census with that kind of database, which would give you all of the information in the census about your citizens and members. I haven't seen this actually done successfully yet, but to me, it's a tremendous opportunity if all of the data sovereignty and data governance pieces are in place and are solid. So this would be pretty much an expert data user could successfully embark on that road. As I said, the APS is off territory. In general, it's got a small sample, and so it's mostly designed for reporting at a provincial level. And so my recommendation in terms of using the APS would be in developing a comparison, most likely, or it's the only show in town, and for a project for off territory, and so for a project that has a really limited budget, and you're just kind of looking for broad strokes or general statistics, the APS might be a good way to go. Something that I'd like to bring up, I guess, would be a way that you can access the Aboriginal People Survey, and to do some custom work there would be through this real-time remote access portal. And so StatScan is governed by the Statistics Act, and so they've got all of these requirements that they need to follow in terms of what kind of information can be included or released. And one of the ways that you can access the information that satisfies the Statistics Act is through the RTRA. So StatScan would have done all of this vetting and built a system that you can send requests to, and it'll be run on the survey master file, and you get your tables back. So it's basically like a really quick turnaround custom tabulation process. And so I'm going to speak a little bit more about custom tabs in the next slide, and maybe you'll see how the RTRA is a way kind of around custom tabs. So on to the next slide. In terms of accessing the census or really any other StatScan product, what we found is when we first started engaging with an organization, and many data users just believe that the information that you get from the census is what's on the website. So you go to the StatScan website, there's the Indigenous Data Portal, there are all these different portals that kind of list all of these tables. And if the table isn't what you're after, most people think they're out of luck. That's really not the case. That's kind of like the lowest level of accessing the census is by going to the website and accessing tables that have already been produced. Basically, those are the product of analysts at StatScan guessing what everyone in Canada is interested about and producing these tables. It's a tiny slice of the pie in terms of what's possible in using the census. And the process through which you can really develop a good understanding of what's possible in the census is by actually downloading the long form questionnaire. It's available on StatScan's website. Read the questions that they ask every person that responds to the long form census, and develop an understanding of what's possible. This has been a really powerful practice for us. There are questions on the census that have never made it into a single public table. So there are questions around mobility and accessibility on the census that StatsCan does not produce public tables for those questions. Most people don't even know that they exist on the census, but they're asked to millions of people every time the census is enumerated, and they can be used really effectively in projects. So it's much more powerful to understand the breadth of the material that's covered on the census, and then just use your imagination to see how this can fit in the task at hand or to answer the research question that you're interested in. And once you've done that, then you've got a good handle of your information needs. There are two ways to access that more detailed information. And the one that I would encourage most readily is to engage with StatsCan to do a custom tabulation. We are still hired by people to produce custom tabulations on their behalf, but many of our clients have taken this on themselves as something that they do internally. It's a skill, but it's a valuable skill. And I would say that it's worthwhile learning. So basically, producing custom tabulation requires that you understand how StatsCan codes their information in the census. And so you basically write up a sheet that describes the variables that you want. And you send it off to StatsCan, they deliver it to an analyst, and the analyst will run the table and send it back to you in a format that's referred to as a Beyond 2020 format, which is actually quite a flexible piece of software. And 15 or 20 minutes of training on Beyond 2020, and anyone on this call will be up and running. I would say that, we were describing like which competences could be internal for an expert data user. I would say that understanding what's on the census, understanding how to produce a custom tabulation, and knowing how to use Beyond 2020, that's totally achievable internally. And that gets you a really long way in terms of being an effective user of StatsCan products. And with that knowledge, you'll really have unlocked the potential of this, quite big and important external data source. The final piece on accessing the census, there are these things called research data centers, and they're located at universities across Canada and at Tunney's Pasture at StatsCan. These are air gapped, so they're a room where there's no internet connections. It's like, I've worked in one. It feels like you're entering a bit of a bank vault with a bunch of computers in there, and they've got a StatsCan person supervising the whole operation. And once you are in, so you have to pass a reliability security check. You have to have proposed your research and have that all be approved. You're able to go work on the actual census master file. So with millions of responses, you're able to do your analysis. And I would say that working in the RDCs should be outside of the scope of any user on this call. If you've got a project that requires an RDC, I would encourage partnerships with academics at universities that have access to the RDCs, or engaging with professionals that have a significant amount of experience in using those RDCs. Once you're at the RDC level of accessing the census better have exactly what you want, because we're almost in the realm of the level of effort and budget to go collect our own primary data. So I would say that accessing the RDCs is probably a very rare instance for most folks on this call. I feel like I've been hearing some questions pop up. Is that the case?
There's one question about if for one of the question, there's no generic tab associated with it, how do you go about requesting a custom tab?
Right, so I'll provide contact information for the folks at StatsCan that have been really effective for me. I think that this group is small enough that might get slapped on the wrist, but no, I'm sure that they're happy to support everyone. It's really about building a relationship with the analysts at StatsCan, and there are folks that, their mandate includes serving Indigenous organizations and representatives like the folks on the call, and so we can circulate that information, and that would be the right first step. And so you'd have a call, you discuss the project, and they'd probably go back and forth a few times in terms of defining that custom tabulation. It's less painful than it sounds. on to the next slide. So administrative data sources, like I said at the outset, I think that this is really an untapped resource in terms of informing indicators. I think that there are lots of data generating processes that are kind of a byproduct of your governance that could be harnessed to inform indicators. That said, with all of the enthusiasm that I've had for effectively using administrative data sources, it's been a pretty rare occurrence that we've effectively been able to take an existing administrative data source, work with that department, explain the importance of how we want to use it for these other purposes, develop a data sharing agreement, and then actually have that work. Like, it has happened. But like I think this again would be like a little bit further down the continuum. So you'd have already established, you know, how this health department can share information with the employment and training department, which can share information with potentially, you know, the research department that you might be representing. Those MOUs, those data governance pieces have to be in place for everyone, in my experience, to show up to the table and be willing to share the data that's being generated by their systems and processes. I guess the one thing that I'd like to emphasize on this slide is the value in investing in citizenship and membership databases. This is a really, really powerful tool. This, you know, if you're confident that your database captures everyone that matters for your government in an effective and up-to-date way, that by exercising, you know, your data sovereignty and sovereignty over defining the metrics that represent your organization in negotiations with government, or when you're talking to StatsCan, or in those engagement processes, by being able to say, like, no, we understand that you have information about our citizens, but you don't know who our citizens are. And we know that by having that database, it really shifts the balance of power in a negotiation setting and allows you to take the lead on these data related initiatives in negotiations. So I guess that's just like an encouragement piece. I've really seen a lot of value come from governments and nations investing in those databases, and then that being the single source of truth that represents their citizens or members. That's been really an effective investment for many of the folks that we've worked with. You know, once those foundational pieces are in place, it becomes easy to consider other potential data streams. And I would encourage, you know, simple modern databases can be low cost and helpful. It doesn't have to be a huge thing once those kind of foundational data governance pieces are in place, once the MOUs are in place and people aren't siloed and kind of protective of their data. Once the culture around data in your organization has been established, administrative data sources, to me, are really underutilized. There's a lot of power there. There's a lot of value there. And there are many ways that we can stretch the envelope to gather even more information, just as a byproduct of normal governance practices. And now on the next slide here, I get to take a little break.
I guess the only piece I would add to the administrative data kind of uses here is oftentimes, you know, these are administrative processes that serve business functions that have a lot of value for specific programs or services that government is delivering. And they perhaps haven't been looked at or thought of as data generating processes necessarily. And so those systems might be set up for those program and service needs and not have been linked to, or, you know, able to infer other kind of socioeconomic indicators. So there is this step not only about generating the culture and the agreements and the governance structures around how to use administrative data, but seeing those sources as opportunities and then setting up the privacy and consent sharing kind of pieces around that process or program or policy, so that you can actually make use of this information for different purposes than just what they're originally set up to do, which is often program specific or service specific. So it's again about what are those other kind of pieces of the puzzle that allow you to unlock the potential of an administrative process to answer those socioeconomic and kind of indicator specific questions. So we've already spoken a little bit about what a statement of objectives process might look like, or a meeting might look like. really this section's about a few steps that you can undertake at the outset before you decide, are we going to undertake a survey, or are we going to collect external data sources, or are we going to take a look at our administrative data sources? Really, this is the first step to kind of any of those types of projects, to be able to understand what the objectives are, what's feasible, how to go about doing it in the most effective way, and ideally also be identifying those additional opportunities to be moving and growing your data capacity. So in terms of this section, we'll talk a little bit about an overview of what the statement of objectives process is, and I put it in little air quotes because it's a pretty flexible process that can be changed. So I don't want folks to think that there is a singular version of this process. And then we'll talk a little bit about each of the steps that that the statement of objectives process kind of undertakes and entails. So next slide here. So what do we mean when we say statement of objectives process? It's a process where you set out to answer key questions to inform your data project. So what information is going to be of the highest use and importance? What information is already collected or available? What, for instance, survey responses will be used for, or data that you're collecting will be used for? What are those key definitions and terms for consideration? And when we take these requirements and we integrate them all into either a questionnaire or the design of your research project, you're more likely to have a outcome that leverages those opportunities and is an effective process to actually getting to the objective you're most interested in. Next slide here. So the key aim is to ensure that your data project actually meets the objectives you want it to achieve and answers those key research questions. Next slide. So what are those steps? We start with that statement of information needs. We talk about data and data users, data uses and data users. We talk about concepts and operational definitions, research design, and an analysis plan. And so like I mentioned in the kind of key takeaways before we dove into the material, this is a process that you might want to undertake with your specific department on your specific project. And you might want to own this entire process and undertake all these steps yourself and produce a bit of documentation or a document at the end of the process that kind of clarifies and answers all these questions. It's also an option in this process to, for instance, undertake and explore the statement of information needs with a larger group. So for instance, sometimes we've brought in together managers or directors or kind of VPs from different organizations. We talk with them about the first two steps, and then we might engage a different group of people to talk about concepts and operational definitions. And so that might look like engaging director level folks to talk about information needs and uses, and then talking to kind of program delivery people or service providers to talk about concepts and operational definitions, so that you're kind of gearing your questions to the right audiences. So again, this isn't a process that one person sits down and does the whole thing on their own. It's useful to think about who needs to be in the room for these different types of conversations. How do we bring the right people together to collect the right information to make this the most useful process for the government overall? So next slide here. The first step is stating your information needs. So again, this is about answering questions. Why has this project been suggested in the first place? What are the stated and unstated goals of those involved? So oftentimes different departments will be coming together, or potentially one department will be undertaking a research project, but there may be other departments or areas of your government that are interested in the project. And they may have told you what those goals are, and they may not have, and you might know them from having worked with them for a long time. And so it's useful at this stage to map out what those interests are, what those goals are, to be able to effectively meet as many of the goals as you can as possible. And also it's useful to be able to communicate to folks, hey, we understand that you're interested in this, but it's really out of scope, it's not feasible, and communicate that up front so that they don't see a final report or some kind of final list of indicators and feel like their work isn't reflected in the project that you've undertaken. So this is all useful in terms of kind of bringing together the pieces of information to communicate with other people about the work that you're undertaking. So what questions are you interested in answering? We'll talk a little bit about how you can go about refining those questions from, a vague interest in something like the well-being of youth or elders in a given community or in a given nation, and getting that down to a bit more specifics. And I think this would probably overlap with some of the indicator development conversations that have been had in previous webinars. And then what are the specific topics you'd like to better understand? So, part of the real value in this process is that oftentimes when we work with groups or multiple people within an organization, everyone has slightly different answers to these questions. They all think they have the same answer. They all think they're at the table for the same reasons. But when you actually sit down and ask the question, people have different expectations. And so again, this is about mapping all those out and then ideally trying to come to some consensus about what's the core thing you're setting out to achieve. And you do all that work before you invest in a survey or before you invest in a custom tab request or before you invest in a literature review or case studies or interviews, because it's a lot easier to understand these objectives before in the planning stage rather than after, once you've actually done the work and or are partway through the work. Next slide here. So there are some different kind of ways. So this is an example of how you might go from an initial research interest down to a more specific research question or the development of more specific indicators. So there's an option, you want to obviously state what your research interest is and what your motivation is. It might be useful to go to the literature or to speak to colleagues from other nations and other people on the SGIG table to say, what have you done? What has been useful in your context? As a general step, it's always useful, or we've often found it's been very useful to look at the secondary data, no matter what the project is, and just see what's out there, see how people have asked the question, see what data is there, and then kind of pick and choose whether it makes sense for you to make use of that data or maybe replicate some of the questions in an existing questionnaire and be building from the work of other people and other organizations. And so those kind of 3 steps get you a little bit closer to a more kind of specific and finalized research question. And I think in terms of, what we think about research, it's not necessarily research in the academic sense. This can be about developing those socioeconomic indicators. It can be about accessing different sources of data. So this is kind of our general catch-all, data use. So data use is probably a better term than, I guess, research in this context, but getting down to that core question, what are you setting out to answer? Next slide here. So data uses and data users. So who is actually going to be making use of this information? Are you analyzing a relationship? Are you trying to describe a situation? Are you trying to share your successes? And then what types of decisions might be made? These are all really important questions to think about and to answer upfront because as Hannes mentioned, there's really different scales in terms of investment that you can put in to acquiring and working with your data. So if your data use is really, we need to put together some metrics that help us better understand and communicate our story, and this is a one-off thing, we need to do it once to support a proposal to government, that's a very different kind of level of investment than this is indicator that we've decided that's based on our community's interest that we want to report out on every quarter. That type of data collection you may want to invest more in and to make sure that you're actually laying some foundations and potentially looking at your administrative data sources so that into the future you're not continually grappling with the same issues over and over. So understanding those users and uses allows you to make decisions in terms of how much you want to invest in this project. How do you decide between, for instance, sampling a few folks from your citizenship versus doing a census of your entire membership or entire list of citizens? Answering these questions allows you to make a much more informed decision about how you actually go about undertaking the project and building indicators or requesting data from different sources. The next slide here is around concepts and operational definitions. So again, some kind of jargony terms here, but who is your target population? And so this would be about, the example I provided earlier. When you think of youth, is that, ages 0 to 25? Is that ages, 18 to 24? Are we talking about more adolescence age? So these are really important questions to answer before you actually go and see whether there's data that can support this in your existing systems or whether this is something that you actually need to go out and be seeking data from other sources or collecting data on your own. Similarly, are you interested in understanding an individual's experience, or maybe you're interested in a household's experience? Maybe you're interested in folks who are living in urban centers nearby your traditional territory or maybe very far from your traditional territories. These are the kinds of questions, again, that really define how you go about answering your questions in a way that actually meets your research interest or your research need. The next slide here is on research design. So it's really dependent on your project. I don't have a whole lot to say here, but you can imagine how those first 3 steps would really inform how you go about designing your question or what your survey strategy might look like, whether you can just go and do a custom tab request or whether it makes sense to take a look at your administrative data sets and maybe invest in those. It's really project dependent, but it's a really critical step in this process to actually think about and design how you're going to go about answering these questions. So oftentimes we kind of try to jump a few steps to the most flashy and exciting part of a project, which is, going out and doing your interviews or going out and surveying folks or going out and collecting information. And this step is really about laying out the plan and trying to figure out what assumptions are reasonable, what methodology makes sense versus in terms of both feasibility and cost once you've answered some of those questions around your objectives up front. And then the last piece of the puzzle here for your statement of objectives, this is just next slide here, is around your analysis plan. So what tables, what graphs, what indicators are you actually looking to produce? And then you want to just do your kind of triple check, make sure that the questions that you're asking in your survey or your questionnaire or the custom data that you're requesting actually meets those objectives. So you might have a kind of a vision in your mind and you've had lots of conversations with different people about the objectives at this stage. You've been thinking deeply in your kind of planning process. This is the last stop before you actually embark on kind of doing your project and acquiring new data. Is let's really make sure before we go and survey everyone that those survey questions can actually produce the analysis we're most interested in. So are you interested in a correlation between or a relationship between 2 things? Is it feasible with the sample size you have to be able to reasonably consider there being like enough people in both groups to make that comparison? So I feel like as the words are coming out of my mouth, I'm realizing that these aren't terms that we've really introduced in this webinar. So if people have kind of more questions on what that analysis plan can look like, we're happy to spend some time towards maybe the end or at any point, but maybe towards the end talking about those if that's of interest. And just the last slide here on the analysis plan. So, in the example of a questionnaire or a survey, you're going to have lots of information collected about individual records, and then you want to process and analyze that information, and then you want to be able to produce those different types of charts or visualizations potentially that track things over time. And so that analysis plan is, again, making sure that all of those tables and charts are feasible and possible given the research design you've selected. Hannes, anything that you wanted to add in here before we move on to primary data collection?
I think just maybe understanding the constraints of the project as well and having those explicitly stated at the outset, like how much money do we have to do this? That really defines what's possible. And an explicit discussion around the constraints of the project is also a helpful step. And I also think doing this work, so doing this statement of objectives work, is a great way to build a proposal for a project as well, right? If you've done all of this work and you've clearly documented your information needs and you've gone through this, I mean, shopping this around to fund a research project, once you've done all of this work, is a piece of cake at that point. You can pull together a 2-pager based on the output of this exercise that would be really helpful in terms of funding the project itself.
Mm-hmm. Any questions from the group before we move on? I guess I have one more piece to add here. This is something that we've adopted and kind of has grown organically alongside learning from many, many projects over the years. So it's something that we're constantly kind of refining and tweaking and working with to make our processes more effective. And the kind of biggest win we see with this, and I feel like we've said it a lot today already, is really around you allow yourself the planning and the opportunity and laying out all those expectations so that by the time you get to your final report, that review of your final report or that review of your final metrics or whatever the kind of output of your product and project is, there's so much more momentum behind it. People understand what you're trying to achieve and do, and people really have a far more narrow scope of kind of feedback to provide on the project. So when you're investing in this upfront, it really saves you a lot of time in getting people on board at the end of your project, or making use of the information at the end of your project, because you've asked the right people those questions all along, and they understand kind of where they fit into and how they're going to benefit from or make use of this data in the outset. So it also allows those organizations to kind of move around along that continuum by engaging many people in the conversation, rather than just trying to kind of solve your problem individually with your own department or your own project team. That is it for me. I'll hand it back over to Hannes. I did see a comment that popped up in the chat, but
yeah, I'm not sure. Well, I know these slides will be made available, and we've got lots of material on analysis plans. We could provide an example as well. Michelle would be happy to send you one to see what they ultimately look like for specific projects as well. So beyond this, yeah, right on. Okay. All right, this next section, primary data collection. So I feel like up until now, this has all been pretty high level. And now we kind of get into the weeds a little bit. So at this point, we're kind of assuming that you've decided to do a primary data collection exercise, and you're gonna like go out and do it on your own and write your own questionnaire. And in as much as that's kind of scary, like even as someone that's been doing this for a long time, when you're writing a questionnaire, it's kind of an intimidating process, because we've all heard about these horror stories about how poorly, there's an example I remember, a national scale survey that went out and asked businesses about their revenue, and they had bins for responses, right? And this was like a really key question on this questionnaire. They spent hundreds of thousands of dollars collecting this information. And so they had like 0 to 10, 10 to 20, all, and then the last response was break even. So what that does, right? So you've got gross revenue is an acceptable response for all the first 6 responses. And then the last one is actually a response about net revenue, right? About profits. And this was a question that the entire analysis of the exercise turned on. We had to be able to categorize businesses by, so just for clarity, we didn't design a questionnaire. We were brought in after the fact to analyze the data. But so this one question was like, all of a sudden you just can't use it anymore, because you've got an acceptable response that is actually an acceptable response to a different question. So I feel like, if you've been in this space and heard some of these horror stories, questionnaire design is kind of intimidating, because small mistakes like that can have huge, huge consequences. That said, there are some general rules of thumb and some tests that you can do with your survey to kind of make sure that you don't make a mistake like that. And so that's what we'll cover in this section. Next slide. So I know that this is almost an unreasonable expectation, but your survey should aim to take less than 5 minutes. We need to be really cognizant of the response burden that going out and asking people to respond to these surveys takes. If your survey is too long, if it's too cumbersome, response rates will drop dramatically. And the worst part about that is that the folks that you probably really want to talk to the most are the ones that will drop out. And so that introduces bias into your response and really makes your data much less valuable. So there's really, it's funny because sometimes we work with clients that want to design these questionnaires, and I think that they have the impression that we want fewer questionnaires because it's less work for us or something. And we're constantly insisting that we cut questions, but really like that's not at all the case. I mean, it's not any more work for us to put out 100 questions or 10. It's a lot more work actually to get to the 10 right questions, right? But yeah, so brevity is key in terms of a high response rate and producing high quality data. Whenever possible, use images, Likert scale questions. So this is like the strongly disagree to strongly agree. There are many different versions of Likert questions. Randomization, so you've got a multiple response question, making sure that the acceptable responses are randomized. This is a feature of most reasonably sophisticated software. I guess I would just say, and I don't mean this as an endorsement of a particular product, but this is like the first question that we get when people are going down this road. And we've done a ton of research in this space in terms of which software to use. And like, there are multiple options. I'll just say that we do use Qualtrics, which is what we've settled on organizationally. I don't mean that to be as like, go use Qualtrics. I'll say that they're expensive. They're more expensive than basically anything else out there. I would look for opportunities to work with multiple departments to get a single license, or even multiple governments to get a single license if you're going down that road. I would say SurveyMonkey is probably not the direction that you want to go, for many reasons, some of them related to data sovereignty and just general business practices. And so, yeah, Qualtrics is what we use. Qualtrics is what we settled on. I actually have a paper that we've written for clients that we could distribute around the costs and benefits of different options, just to save some time. I know that everyone kind of runs into that. It's kind of a stumbling block. It's like, well, what the heck do you use? And so, yeah, I'd be happy to circulate that. Right, randomization. So using randomization whenever possible. And so the example that I used was, if you have a multiple choice question, you've got acceptable responses A through D. If you actually randomize those, so each person responding to the survey sees them in a different order, you'll get a more accurate response, because there is a tendency for people to select based on the ordering of responses, not even necessarily what they truly believe. And so by randomizing the response, that's one way that you can mitigate those kinds of bias. There are other ways to introduce randomization into your survey as well.
I would say also, if you are interested in something like staffing issues and you ask people 15 different questions about how many staffing issues they experience, and then your last question is, thinking about all the issues you face, how important is staffing? They're very likely to say staffing is the most important thing, because they've just spent 15 minutes ranting and raving about all their staffing issues through your survey. So if you have the option to randomize the location of that question within your survey, it will more likely limit that, what's called kind of a priming effect of questions, where the order and the way that the information is presented influences the likelihood of answering one way or the other. And like Hannah said, most survey tools have some, or software tools have some kind of feature that allows you to randomize those questions.
Yeah, I'm going to skip to the next slide because I really want to get through this material. There's something called an attention budget. So, and this is, we see a couple comments in there of someone that explicitly ran out of their attention budget. And so we want to be cognizant of the attention budget. And so you burn through your respondent's attention budget in two ways: too many questions or complex questions. So not all questions are created equal, right? An easy question burns up less of the attention budget than a complex question. So this is why there's so much emphasis on streamlining everything and being cognizant of your respondent's attention budget. And so when we say that those 5 minutes, that's like something that we've had experience with, that you'll get high response rates if you can keep it under 5 minutes and manage your respondent's attention budget. Consistency. So I say this, I don't know how many times I say be consistent in a given day, but this goes with all sorts of reporting and after your survey as well, being consistent in use of terms. But it's really key to use the same name for the same thing, especially if you have to introduce it and include a definition. As someone that's, if you're writing the questionnaire, you're obviously fluent with the content, and you might have multiple words to describe the same thing, but yeah, it is overwhelming when people aren't respecting the attention budget. People just start dropping off. But yeah, so that consistency is really key. So if you're calling it climate change, you define climate change at the outset of your questionnaire, and that's the only way that you refer to that concept in your questionnaire. That consistency is really key for ensuring that you've got high quality and high fidelity data at the outset, or at the conclusion of your survey. On to the next. Avoid negatives. The word not often just gets skipped over, and you'll find half of the people responded it with one understanding of the question, the other half responded it with another understanding, and your data is useless. Be exact. So describe a reference period very precisely, as opposed to some general description like in a typical week, as opposed to in the last 7 days. Preempt guessing. Yeah, so for questions like that revenue question, for example, as a business owner, if someone asked me about my revenue, I wouldn't be able to respond exactly, but I could probably give them a sense of of the general range. So using ranges is effective for questions where people are likely to be guessing. On to the next. Neutral, unassuming language. So this is important, especially if we're tackling some socioeconomic injustice or some concept that is married to a lot of emotion. It's easy to write that emotion into your questionnaire. And this example, as a small dog owner, I relate to this example. So asking about small dogs and not small yappy dogs is a good example of language to avoid, and trying to stay neutral in the language that you use. Using skip patterns is great. However, I saw the comment there, and I mean, this happens to me all the time. Sometimes you feel like you answered a question with a yes, and then you get 30 additional questions because you answered yes. So being honest about the paths that these skip questions can create. What is a 5-minute questionnaire for someone might be a 30-minute questionnaire for someone if you've got a lot of this, if the 5 minutes is dependent on everyone skipping large sections of the survey. So using skip patterns is useful, but be cognizant when you're using them of the kind of crazy paths that it can create for survey respondents. It's also a lot harder when you use skip patterns to test your survey, because you've got to test every possible outcome. On to the next one. Right, non-responses. So the reason why we use non-responses is because we don't want people to drop out. There's a frustration when you're forcing someone to answer a question with a set of predetermined responses that doesn't align with their desired response. Giving them an out, like a don't know or prefer not to answer, is a good way to keep them going on to the next question instead of dropping out of the survey altogether. I already spoke to Likert scales and their usefulness, and so this is a way to, it's still qualitative, but it's a way to kind of get at a little bit more granularity around degrees of agreement or importance. And so we use a lot of Likert scales. We like using them. Also, the visualizations that you can produce with Likert scales are interesting. Yeah, not applicable, exactly. Next slide. Rebecca, do you want to go through the testing piece?
Sure, yeah. So important kind of piece to the primary data collection is testing your survey. And some of the pieces that we encourage everyone who's in survey design to think about is, it's really easy to just skim and review a survey and be looking for things like grammar or, whether it meets your expectations. Say you've, participated in this process and we finally got in our first draft survey. And what we kind of encourage in the survey testing piece is to really try to put on different lenses and to look at the survey and try to take the survey as if you're someone different in different shoes. And that's the way you figure out whether, you've missed an opportunity where an NA question is really important, or you've introduced a skip logic that doesn't make sense. So we try to start by asking, pretend that this survey is something that lands in your inbox. Imagine all the horror stories that we've just shared over chat, and then go about trying to take the survey yourself and see how that experience goes and whether you can answer all the questions easily and accurately. And then the next step is thinking about, could your friends do this survey? Could your family or peers undertake this survey? Could colleagues at the government you're working for or with undertake this survey? Could they all answer that question, all these questions accurately and easily? And then the last kind of step is really extrapolating out to where is this survey going and what are all the possible people that could be taking this survey. So we've been working with an organization who has a large network of individuals who have been going through post-secondary. And we're trying to figure out how you can survey anyone who may or may not have had a touch point with this organization in the last 5 years, for instance. And you try to ask a question around, employment status. And you ask, are you working part-time? Are you working full-time? Which are kind of the standard way we think about jobs. But when we go through this testing process, you kind of try to find the example, like I'm an Uber driver in Toronto and I work part-time at a cafe, but I'm also Uber driving and delivering stuff. Like, how does my experience fit into these categories? And you realize really quickly there's generally a ton of examples that just don't fit neatly into these categories. And those are the people who will take the survey and say, I don't see what option makes sense for me. I don't know how to answer this question. My attention budget is up. This is too complex, and they'll end up dropping out. And those are individuals who might have a really interesting experience to share, who might have really unique circumstances, and who might be really important to capture in your data collection activities. So testing surveys fundamentally is just about trying to put, not only making sure that everything flows and looks good and feels good and is easy, but trying to put yourself in a lot of different shoes and wearing a lot of different hats to make sure that these are all questions that anyone could answer. And if they're not, why is that? And is that reasonable for your survey, or do you need to adjust the question to make it compatible with other people's experiences? So next slide here, I'll just actually skip over this. This is pretty well the same kind of example that we just talked about around putting yourself in different people's shoes. And when you're testing surveys, as I say, you want to think bigger picture. So what's the length, energy, thought requirement, relevance, ability to generate your tables and charts? So how does this survey fit into all the planning you've done to date? But then also the smaller picture, what's the font size? Is the color appropriate? If I was looking at this on a cell phone, or if I was, I know someone put in the chat an example of having someone with an iPad show up to a door. Does the formatting make sense on an iPad? Does the question wording make sense if you were sharing this over the phone? Those kind of smaller details go a long way in making the experience of taking a survey a lot easier. And the easier the experience is, the more likely people are to finish the survey, the more likely people are to answer questions accurately and not get tripped up trying to figure out what are you asking because the formatting is distracting or they're not sure how to actually interact with the platform you've chosen to use. We have a bit of a checklist here. So on the next slide, we talk about, making sure questions are necessary. So a few kind of questions to ask yourself as you go through your review and you're looking at a specific question. You want to ask yourself essentially these questions about that question in your survey as you're thinking about testing it. So is this something that's necessary? There's a few questions there. Does it, does it actually link to and is it required for the success of your analysis plan? If not, you should have a really good rationale for it being there. Because if it's not actually contributing to your analysis plan, it is just another response burden, opportunity for people to drop off, opportunity for people to get frustrated. On the next slide, we talk about clarity. So again, do you have to read the question more than once or twice to understand it? Did you use spell check? So usually there's an option in Word, or there's an option even in the software platforms themselves to use spell check. Does the location in which the question appear in the survey make sense? Or are you asking a bunch of things about income and then all of a sudden there's a question about small yappy dogs, and you're very confused about why you're being asked this question all of a sudden, and it's an opportunity to throw people off. Is the question leading? Are you forcing an answer that they might not agree with? So again, it's about all of these rules of thumbs and just asking yourself these questions while you're reading your survey and thinking critically about the answers to those questions. I'm just cognizant that we're running up at the end of the time. The next slide is just around simplicity. So reading level is really important for questions, because regardless of who the audience is for your survey, the lower the reading level, the easier it is for people to understand what you're asking, and it makes reading and like the complexity of your exercise a lot lower. So it's good no matter who you're working with. And then the next two pieces are just on piloting and review. So again, this is about, if we just skip the next two slides here, these are really just around making sure that once everything's in there, you're actually seeking feedback from a whole bunch of different people and monitoring that data collection to make sure that the data that you're collecting makes sense to you and you can tweak potentially. So that's it for me on testing your survey. And honestly, I think we only have 10 minutes left here, so I'm not sure how. I know you have, well, I can still have like 30 minute slides or something comical, so I don't know how we want to spend our time.
I've got like some highlights. I'll do my best. Okay, so next slide, please. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each one. So just the major difference here, these are a few examples between a census, which is when you go out and you speak to everyone in the population that you're interested in, and a survey, which is where you would take a sample of the population that you're interested in, and then you do what's called inferential statistics. So you speak to the entire population, having only sent a questionnaire to a sample. And so I don't know if it's well known. I mean, there are many uses for statistics, but the big thing with inferential statistics, this whole discipline is around saving money. The idea is that you can not have to talk to everybody and still get answers that represent everybody. That's the concept between doing a survey as opposed to a census. And the other thing that I'd really like to highlight on this slide is people tend to want to go do a census. Now, the challenge with the census is that you're going to have people that don't want to respond. And often those are the people that you need to speak to the most. They're either in marginalized conditions, they don't have the time or the attention budget to respond to your questionnaire. And if you're interested in socioeconomic outcomes, for example, those are the people that you really want to engage with. And so in a census, you're going to have to speak to all of those people. But because you're speaking to everyone, you've really kind of blown the budget. So a really nice thing that we found with the survey is that you can really spend a lot more time and energy and money, if you've done this correctly, in making sure that those people that are on the margins that would probably drop out if you could only, if you only could afford one touch point and maybe one follow-up with everyone in a census situation, if you're doing a survey, because you're speaking to a smaller number of people, you can double down and, do 3 or 4 touch points or include, some form of compensation or a prize that you might not otherwise be able to afford, and really focus on engaging with those people that are the least likely to respond to your survey, because those are the people that you need most importantly to speak with. It's kind of this challenge, right? Folks that are doing okay, that are doing great, that have the time to come to respond to your survey. Unfortunately, I mean, those are the people that were least likely, or least that are least important to respond to the survey, particularly if we're interested in like socioeconomic outcomes. Next slide. So there are different ways to do a sample, to do a survey. A convenience sample, which is what's done most. So all of marketing questionnaires, when you just take a questionnaire, you push it out into the ether, and you just take back whatever comes back. That is called a convenience sample. This is the easiest, cheapest way to do things. The problem with convenience samples is that they generally introduce a lot of bias. You're just going to hear back from people that have the time, energy, and interest, and that is likely not to include people that you're really concerned about. And so there are ways to do convenience samples that mitigate those effects, and I'll get into that, but this is the lowest cost, but also produces the lowest fidelity of data ultimately. Next slide. I'm just going to go to the next slide. A simple random sample. So this is, now we're using the tools of statistics. This is like the big leagues. What you need though to do a sample, like a probability-based sample, is you need a frame. And so this is where that investing in that citizenship or membership database becomes so valuable. That is the master list. That's your entire population of interest, for example, and you can use that to produce a sample. If you don't have a master list, if you don't have a frame from which you can draw a sample, you're stuck in the world of convenience sampling. And so we've used things, for example, like tax rolls can serve as a household frame, or citizenship membership databases are really useful. Otherwise, you're kind of, like I said, confined to that world of like putting your questionnaire out into the ether and dealing with whatever you get back. I'll go into the next one. And I'll just keep going through. I'll just try and introduce each of these different types. A stratified sample. So this is an example where you've got groups within the population of interest that are expected to be different along dimensions that you're interested in. So a good example was 2014, we did a survey for the city of Prince Rupert. There was the Petronas LNG project was proposed. They were really concerned about what was going to go on in their community. And so they wanted to do a survey before that happened so they could follow up years later and understand the impact of the project. And they were really interested in different housing types. And so we stratified that sample by housing type because we expected that the impacts of the project would impact people in different housing types differently. So specifically, we wanted to make sure that subsidized housing and different housing types along the housing continuum were treated separately because we expected that people in those living conditions would have responses that are materially different from each other. So when you know that the group that you're interested in is going to have differences in groups within the ultimate population, you want to plan for that. And you use a stratified sample for that. the effect is often that the overall sample size will increase because you're interested in being able to report out for individual groups within your larger population. On to the next slide, please. So this opens up a whole world of different use cases. However, it's a little bit more costly, and it requires additional setup and planning. It's not overly cumbersome, and I would say that a vast majority of the projects that we do now are some form of a stratified sample. On to the next slide. Post-stratification, this is actually a really powerful tool, and if I could emphasize one thing from this section, it's being able to effectively use post-stratification, because what this allows you to do is use semi-fancy statistical techniques to imitate a probability-based sample. So if you push out a convenience sample, so you just send it out to everyone on the mailing list and ask them to share it as broadly as they can, you publish it on Facebook, you're just doing a convenience sample. This is low cost, low effort, and what you do after you get that information back is what's called post-stratification. So what we'll do then is we'll define the population that we're interested in an external data source like the census, and you can weight the responses from your convenience sample and adjust for the bias that convenience sample produces by weighting the responses using this post-stratification technique. So, for example, suppose you distribute a survey to everyone that's going to a particular university, and what you hear back, and you look at your responses when you get them back, and the average age of respondents is like 35, and you've got clearly weighted towards like older students. You think, well, that's not representative of the demographic going to that school. What post-stratification does is it takes all of those responses and you take the actual demographic profile that's present at the school and you reweight your responses to mitigate the bias that's introduced by having done a convenience sample. I would say that 75% of the projects that we work on use this post-stratification technique because the budget just doesn't, you either don't have the budget to do a proper random sample or you don't have a sample frame. Another example, I worked actually with Belinda. I remember we did the survey of Inuit artists in 2016. There was no way, I mean, we don't have a list of everyone in Canada, so there's no way that we can do a random sample. So we went out and spoke to as many as we could, and then we used the census after the fact to adjust to ensure that our sample was representative. This is a powerful technique that I would encourage people to investigate if they're going to be conducting convenience samples in particular. On to the next, and I'll just keep going. Next one. I'm going to skip the rest of post-stratification. In terms of privacy, Rebecca, do you want to speak to these privacy slides?
I think we've got 45 minutes next week.
Oh yeah, okay, sure.
So we can probably just skip over those. I think all you have left is just to repeat the key takeaways. And I'm not sure, Harmony, if you want to close us off with anything just in this last couple minutes here. Sure.
So if you'll recall on to the next slide, the first key takeaway, the most important step in acquiring data is deeply understanding your information needs. In terms of understanding your information needs, this is best achieved in a structured and coordinated setting. So Rebecca went through a bunch of steps in terms of how to achieve that. The second takeaway, there's this continuum, right? Novice to expert data users. And I think the key takeaway here is that doing this work will incrementally move you along that continuum towards becoming an expert data user. And so incremental progress is still progress, and that's what we're shooting for in many of the projects that we undertake. The final slide. Primary data collection, it's serious business, but it can be really beneficial when it is the right option. It can produce tremendous results, but it's a serious undertaking and not something that you should really take too lightly. You're doing a big project when you're going out into the world and collecting primary data. And here we go. Noon.
That was awesome. Thank you. That was a lot of information. I think between yesterday and today, we're consuming a lot of information, but it's all here. It'll be posted for you on the site so that you can return back to it. And, part of the strategy here in these 6 webinars is give you a total skim so that you can also give us feedback about what would be most useful to you to dive into in more detail, more applied webinars or supports, advisory services, etc., kind of in the conclusion of the webinar. So Next session is next Friday. We'll have Big River back, and we'll have Bobby and Stuart presenting for us, which is awesome. They're waving on the camera now. Utilize the advisors. Feel free to contact me if I can be of any help to you. We're going to do a pop-up poll, and now I'm nervous about it because I feel like it's going to be like the totally wrong method, and we're going to get, we just learned about how to do this properly. So thanks everybody for joining, and we look forward to seeing you next Friday.